and there's that nice little voice telling us that the recording is in progress. So at this point, I would like to introduce, or I don't have information about them. Perhaps they can tell us a little about themselves. Sarah Glynn and John Clarke, and then they will divide the time to make a 25-minute presentation. Sarah and John, over to you.
Are you okay for me to start,
Your
John?
evening.
Absolutely, Sarah, you go first.
Yeah, I mean we've written the we pamphlet book, whatever you want to call it, booklet, together, and I did the first two parts, so I was going to do the first bit today, and John did the third part, so he's going to pull it all together at the end. And yeah, a bit about me. Well, we've both of us had an activist background and also a background in writing and stuff. So anyway, you don't really need to know about me. It's more important to sort of go straight onto the subject, I think, because we've got rather short amount of time. I am going to use a PowerPoint, which is good because then you can look at that and not at me. So I shall just work out how to get us onto screen share. Share, share the
that's working.
Perfect. Okay, and play. Right. So just to launch straight in, I'm sure that most of you'd agree that most books and articles about climate change and the wider ecological crisis tend to be written from a very middle-class perspective, and they ignore people who can't take for granted a well-paid job and enough to live on. And even if they do question the economic system that created the crisis, they still tend to ignore working-class concerns. So just to take the word degrowth, yes, it's a word with a fine academic and activist pedigree, but it immediately conjures up images of redundancy and all that implies. You've got another request for admission? Yeah, sorry. Climate activism, too, tends to be organised as a very middle-class pursuit. Hence, we see Extinction Rebellion's really poor choice of targets, like blocking public transport so people couldn't get to work, and their courting of arrest, which is much more serious implications for working class people than for middle class people. And this, I would say, largely unconscious elitism tends to alienate working class people and thus can even provide opportunities for right-wing populist theories, like the frankly bizarre idea that the 15-minute city is some sort of ghetto or concentration camp. And this is especially problematic because working class people are, of course, those who are most or worst affected by climate change, despite being the least responsible. And they're the people who can change the system and save our planet for humanity. And the upper and middle classes, the people who are most responsible, are simply too invested in the system to countenance any significant disruption to it. And what's even more important than their consumption and their lifestyles are their businesses and their investments. So if we want change, we need to look at the collective power of the working class. And happily, the actions that are needed to prevent climate change and ecological destruction are the same as those that benefit the working class as a whole, because workers and nature are exploited by the same system. Capitalism sees both only as a source of potential profit. And we've used little quotes from people who are rather better known than us as illustrations in the booklets. I'll just give you a few minutes to read these ones. And even beyond climate change, there's, of course, a more general threat from capitalism's exploitation of the planet. Market competition means that no business can afford to be content with what it has, or it'll simply be overtaken by its competitors. They need to find new markets and create new demand. And capitalism just needs to grow to survive. So it makes infinite claims on the world's finite resources. And the threat from all this to the planet is so large that society seems to be sort of paralyzed in front of it. People just don't know what to do. But once we understand that this threat comes from the same capitalist forces that dominate our everyday lives, then the way forward becomes clear. The fight against the system that's destroying our planet is the same as the fight against the system that's producing ever more mind-boggling inequalities, which is, of course, why you exist as a group. So I'm preaching to the converted, of course. But the book responds to the mismatch between environmentalism and environmental and social reality. And we hope that it can provide a tool for workers and activists who are trying to make the world a world that's environmentally sustainable and better for everyone. So it's our wee bit in a fight against the biggest challenge of our time. And we don't claim to be giving any new discoveries or any new theories. We aim just to clarify in everyday language the social, economic, and political processes that create the crisis and give some pointers in how to work towards the necessary changes in which societies are run. It's a big subject, it's a big task. We hope we've produced something that's user-friendly and that can help people to begin to map out actions that are both beneficial in themselves and can contribute towards more fundamental change. So the essence of the first section is summed up in this short piece that we've used as a preface. Climate change is a class issue, not just because the 1% produce the most carbon dioxide, though they do, or because those at the bottom feel the effects first, though that's true, or because elites use their crisis as an excuse to squeeze the rest, when won't they? Or because countries that pollute the least suffer the worst, when don't they? But because the system that exploits the planet to destruction is the same that depends on class exploitation, the system that sees everything in terms of profit, which is what capitalism is. While the changes needed to bring our world back from the precipice are the same that would end this class exploitation, an economy of the people, by the people, and for the people, which is what socialism should be. And what can make this happen, if not the combined power of the working class? So each of these phrases becomes a section heading, and along the way, the book looks at reactions to climate change as an example of disaster capitalism, how energy saving has become treated as just another business opportunity, why we can't rely on tax incentives, and how new technologies, though these can be helpful, are not enough. How the exploitation by poor countries by the rich mirrors class exploitation. And of course, the workings of capitalist propaganda, how we've been told to fear change because we'll lose our freedom and way of life, without asking what freedoms. Is this the freedom to exploit, the freedom to destroy the earth? Or what sort of way of life are we using? We're talking about the capitalist treadmill. And despite most people doing bullshit jobs, people are silenced by fear of unemployment, that there's no shortage of work needed for social improvement, and an economy built for society can provide secure jobs with good conditions, including working hours that allow people to actually enjoy life. We're also told to fear the evil of tax and spend, but in fact, everyone benefits from public investment and public services, and a progressive tax, which should include wealth taxes, is a way of addressing or beginning to address inequality. And each public service is a step towards an economy for society. Workers have the power to force change and also the knowledge and skills to create different ways of doing things. The second part of the booklet is a manifesto for change. It acknowledges that there's not yet popular support for all the changes that are needed, but argues that we can enact and campaign for changes now that are beneficial in themselves, and can help people see the necessity and possibility of more radical change. It sets out the goal of a new economics in which competition and endless growth is replaced by prioritization of human need, and exploitation of people and nature is replaced by human society as part of the natural ecosystem. This goal can be achieved through public investment and involvement at all levels, from the neighbourhood to the state, in response to public need and social priorities. It can inform campaigns and actions in such a way that many small changes trigger larger ones, and people can see how capitalism has blinded them to their real interests. It looks at two kinds of actions: campaigns to force others to act, to produce irresistible pressure on government or local authorities or on employers, and at changes instigated by local communities themselves. And these two kinds of actions can be carried out in parallel. So major structural change requires committed and strategic mass campaigning. And the working class has the power to force change due to its size and due to its vital role in the economy. Workers can also ensure that actions target key points in those structures and can use their skills to devise greener ways of working. Workers aren't victims needing protection as they're so often portrayed. It's not just about preserving jobs or ensuring that when the economy changes, it's not used as an excuse for more of a gig economy. Workers are importantly subjects that can play a proactive role. They can use their combined power to push industries towards green and social alternatives, and to demand public involvement at all levels: state, municipal, and neighbourhood. And so, of course, building strong radical unions becomes a vital part of any ecological strategy. Trade unions that can take a long view and can coordinate across the world. And at the same time as campaigning for public investment, local communities can put fundamental economic principles into practice themselves through mutual aid organisations that can provide an immediate help with daily life and can also provide a model of a different way of approaching the economy and of inclusive democratic structures. And of course, we already depend on community organisations to glue our societies together and make them work. But so many of these are really proudly non-political, so they don't challenge the status quo. But often more politically engaged organisation emerges as a response to external threat. And the booklet includes these two examples. So this is Granby 4 Streets in Liverpool, which evolved from an anti-demolition campaign into a community land trust. And this is their monthly market. And the former GKN auto parts workers in Florence, who developed their factory occupation against threatened closure and layoffs into a mass movement that brings together different struggles for a better way of living. And they've put forward a plan for a green reindustrialization from below. So campaigns like these can move societies onto a more environmentally sustainable path, can bring a better quality of life, and importantly, they can also expose the lies of those who argue that escaping capitalism is impossible and that green politics equals deprivation. And every improvement won can boost demands for further change. It persuades more people what's possible, and it makes the next change easier. And these are hardly new ideas. Here's Karl Marx. Mm-hmm. And just before handing over to John, just a few words about the design. So arguments are vital, but I think a book can also be a nice thing, and it's been a pleasure designing this one. You've already seen how we've used quotes as illustrations. and just the front cover, which uses that familiar image of the pyramid of the capitalist system as drawn for the industrial worker in 1911, drowning in rising sea levels. And I've tried to retain the design in the free online version. And I will stop sharing now and hand over to John.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Sarah. And in what I have to say, I want to focus on the question of the class struggle itself and the implications for the class struggle of climate change, which I think are severely underestimated in most quarters. I should note that I don't really come into this as a long-time climate activist. I was for many years here in Toronto, Canada, where I live, an organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. And so my work consisted of the mobilization of resistance amongst poor working class communities. And the advent of the climate crisis and its intensification really brought home to me that in so many ways the class struggle and climate change become interwoven considerations. And indeed, I would certainly argue that the only way forward in terms of actually making the changes necessary in society that can create a sustainable society are indeed through the agency of the class struggle. And so I think we would probably be like-minded when it comes to the proposition that the capitalist system itself is incompatible with the creation of a sustainable relationship with the natural world. And that is the overriding issue. But at the same time, we obviously don't have the luxury of saying, yeah, climate, let's just get on with the class struggle and one day there'll be a socialist society and we can put things right. We're dealing with a worsening climate disaster that we must address. So in many ways, we have to stay the hand of capital. And that means immediate struggles within this system. And I'm going to suggest that they fall really into two broad categories. One is the struggle that must be taken up for us to travel as far as possible down the road of a just transition towards sustainable forms of production and energy use. But also, we have to deal increasingly with the catastrophic impacts of climate change that are playing out across the world, and no one is exempt. But on the other hand, these effects play out along the fault lines of social, racial, and global inequality, and thus the struggle to survive becomes very much a class-based struggle. Now, I'm based in Canada, and in this country, we have a situation where the need for transition is particularly acute. Canada is amongst the top 10 carbon emitters on the planet. But given the relatively small population of Canada, on a per capita basis, this is probably the worst country of all. And in fact, if you take that into account, it is clear that Canada's appalling role with regards to contribution to the climate crisis is based on the fact that it exports oil and gas products massively. And so the need for a transition here is really, really glaring. As Donald Trump threatens tariffs on Canada, which I'm sure people have heard about, the oil and gas industry is actually doubling down on looking for ways to perpetuate the export of dirty oil products. And there's even this incredibly deranged proposal at the moment to build another pipeline through northern Manitoba and then build a floating platform on which specially reinforced vessels will then export oil and gas through the Hudson Bay out through the Arctic. So I mean, this is the dangers that we're facing with. So it really requires, I think, that we rethink the whole concept of class struggle, and particularly trade union activity, so that we're no longer talking about simply trying to bargain for a better deal within this system, but actually intervening around what is produced, how it's produced, and when it's produced. We can't allow the present course to continue. At the same time, as this crisis accelerates, it is clear as we reach tipping points and as extreme weather, disastrous incidents, and such like continue, chronic effects, as these things go on, it is clear that we are dealing increasingly with a situation where working class people across this country, even in relatively privileged countries, but certainly in the global south to a much greater degree, are going to be dealing with the most catastrophic impacts, whether that's wildfires, whether it's floods, whether it's storms, or whether it's chronic effects like droughts and such like, rising sea levels. These things are going to be dominating our societies to a degree that is already very considerable, but is going to become much greater with the passage of time. And so I'm going to suggest that this accelerating and intensifying climate disaster absolutely redefines the forms of the class struggle. We're going to have to struggle in our workplaces. And it's not going to be simply our putting forward positive demands. We're going to be facing the attacks of the other side. In Florida, for example, the right-wing governor there has intervened to ensure that municipal governments are not allowed to mandate water breaks for construction workers as heat levels increase dramatically. The gig economy workers are dealing with absolutely impossible heat conditions and fighting back on that front. And at the community level, we're going to be dealing with disastrous events in which, left to their own devices, the power structure, the grandees of the power structure will simply abandon us. We've seen that. The appalling floods that occurred a couple of years ago in Pakistan, for example, where the country was absolutely devastated, and yet no serious measures were taken. Not only was there no infusion of funds, but Pakistan is being bled dry by international debt collectors, so that the suffering and needs of millions of people in that country take second place to the dividends of a cocktail lounge full of financiers, which is absolutely impossible to tolerate and put up with. In British Columbia, on the west coast of Canada, we a couple of years ago saw appalling heatwave conditions, and people in the worst housing died in large numbers. Sick and elderly people died in very large numbers. The unfortunately social democratic premier of the province made the infamous observation that death is part of life, and that these things were just inevitable and nothing could be done about it. Those are the kind of situations in which we're going to have to intervene to demand that the services are there to meet people's needs, the public services are there to meet people's needs, the emergency measures are taken, and the contingency plans and the resources necessary are all there. We're going to have to put demands on the state. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we let the state take charge and we leave it to the state, but we're going to have to place powerful demands on capitalist states, and that's going to be an important element of the class struggle. So what I really am suggesting is that that the struggles that we take up are going to take on the dimensions of the creation of an international solidarity for survival, so that people are not abandoned in the face of this situation. And there is, of course, already enormous anger. There is an enormous capacity to fight back if it is given any kind of a lead. When Valencia in Spain was flooded and people died needlessly, the king had the temerity to show up and try and do a walkabout, and he was pelted with mud. And I think that's sort of symbolic of the working class response to what we're facing. So we face enormous challenges. and we have a great deal of work to do to reorientate our movements. But it is the working class and the struggles of the working class that can, first of all, deal with the immediate impacts of climate change, and secondly, create the kind of society that can genuinely create a sustainable relationship with the natural world and a future for humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentations and for the resource that you've given us with your pamphlet, which is available for free online. It can also be purchased, and it's inexpensive. A wonderful resource indeed. Um, Now we have time for about half an hour of discussion. And so I'll take a round of folks who want to either pose questions or share thoughts. Please try to keep your comments fairly brief to allow for most people here to be involved in the discussion. And I see David Schwartzman. Is there somebody else who's thinking of speaking? Okay, Susan. Anyone else? Well, I'll speak for sure. Okay, well, let's start with that, and then others who want to jump in can do so. But first, David.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your presentations. I think your pamphlet will be very useful in our struggle. And I think you covered, pretty comprehensively what our agenda should be. The only caveat I would add is, and this is something that John certainly emphasized in his remarks, is confronting the catastrophic impact of the continued consumption of fossil fuel. And therefore, I would only interject that we need a strategy to defeat fossil capital and its political instruments as soon as possible. Otherwise, the rest of our agenda will be much harder and actually maybe even impossible to implement, because as the 1.5 degrees C uh, warming target is breached in the next few decades, the catastrophes we witness now will be much worse. So I have written on following the lead of Andrea's mom, uh, uh, proposed a eco-Leninist strategy. And I'll just conclude with this. I think we need to build the broadest coalition nationally and globally to defeat fossil capital and its political instruments, and that, at least temporarily, that would need to include so-called green capital, with all its problematics. But so I would that's basically what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Susan?
Yeah, look, thanks, Sarah and John, for your presentations, but also for bringing us this booklet. I think what strikes me about it, I mean, you're both very good communicators, and I've read a lot of Sarah's writing, and I think why I think it's such a good resource is that it's written in very plain English language, and I think it probably lends itself very well to being translated actually into other languages. But it's about, I think, communicating what can be quite a complex set of ideas and potential solutions to a broad audience. And I think it could be a very useful teaching tool, you know, reading group, reading circle tool for working people, for people who are new to climate activism, new to understanding capitalism, and the integration between capitalist exploitation and environmental exploitation. So yes, so thank you very much. I think too, the other thing I found quite interesting was the section, particularly in Sarah's presentation, talking about mutual aid, because I think this is often an area that perhaps, if I could say, the traditional left uh, hasn't necessarily embraced, or has been sort of more associated with an anarchist, if you like, point of view. And I really welcome that section of the booklet, because I do think that it is something we, on the left, we need to grapple with, particularly in the time of climate disaster. And I think too, there've been already, amazing examples of where mutual aid has been a necessity, not because it's actually saved people's lives. And I know, sure, Julia and the comrades in Brazil could talk more about that in terms of the recent flooding there in Rio del Sul, but also in the Philippines, in so many parts of the global south where the state has abandoned people to their fate, and where the organised left or other organised groups have had to step in and actually take charge. We've had similar situations in Australia where that's happened as well, and I do think it's an important it's an important area of intervention or activity for the left, because it's demonstrating very much in practice the limitations of the state under capitalism, but also what human beings and communities can do when they organise together towards a common goal. And I think that's a very powerful example too. And I guess I suppose I'd be keen to hear a bit more from Sarah, because I know, Sarah, that you write a lot about the Kurdish situation, and and having seen the Murray Bookchin quote in the booklet, my thoughts turn to Rojava and the sorts of ecological underpinnings of the experiment going on in northeast Syria. And so I'm kind of interested to hear any comments that you might have, particularly on the situation there in general, in terms of the ecological angle, but also, I guess, the situation there at the moment, especially in the post-Assad period, where things are incredibly dangerous, and where you've got Turkey, bombing that region, and just how, I guess, how things are for the activists, for the comrades who are in that part of the world. So thank you.
Okay, there are a couple of things I want to say first. I've moved myself down on the list, so the next person to speak after I'm done with these very brief remarks will be Mark, and then I'll come in a little bit later. Folks who want to speak, indicate that, please. Raise your hand on the screen. I also want to note that in the chat, there's some interesting discussion. Folks should take a look at that. And perhaps after Mark and myself, we'll pause so that John and Sarah can have some time to respond to some of what's been presented. Mark, you're next.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the presentation. I think, yes, the difficulty is to link the climate struggle and the worker struggle. And in Canada, actually, in Quebec and Canada, actually, there might be an opportunity to do that because Canadian people were in a state of shock after the Trump victory, of course. We've been under attack by tariff and by pretending to include us into the United States. But then some weeks later in Quebec, the Amazon closed all its 7 distribution centers. Actually, all of them were in Montreal. That caused a state of shock in Montreal and Quebec generally. I don't know in Toronto and Canada. I'm not sure of the effect of that. So Amazon is, then there's a mobilization. Yesterday, there were 2,000 people demonstration in Montreal. Of course, it should have been 10,000 on 100,000, but it was a start at 2,000. And fight back against Amazon, obviously, it's a workers' issue, but it's also a climate issue for me because Amazon is the king of let's say, mass consumption. It developed mass consumption. It's rise on mass consumption. It's also a problem with the transportation system, with this truck and all the streets and contributing to congestions. And it's also a problem with energy, with his farm, with his servers for intelligent artificial intelligence and cloud. So it would be easy to combine the two issues in this struggle. And that struggle, people are very angry in Quebec. It's not only the working class; it's the general people in Quebec are very angry. But like closing of seven distribution center at the same time, 5,000 people are losing their job because of that. And the only reason that they're doing that because there was one place and one Amazon warehouse in Quebec where they had managed to unionize themselves, and they were to sign a convention in the next weeks. And in Quebec, contrary to United States, you have to if the company don't want to sign a convention, well, the government oblige them to sign a convention. So they decided to close everything instead of signing a convention. So there's an opportunity here for. Unfortunately, the demands are very basic at the moment. For example, the union want to be paid 1 year of compensation, not 14 weeks. And the larger union, which is syndicated them, asked for a boycott of the company, which is obvious to make. But there would be an opportunity here, let's say, to demand that the distribution of parcels would again be a monopoly of Canada Post, which it was in the past. And it happens that Canada Post is on the verge of bankruptcy. And it happened that Canada Post has one of the more combative and politicized union. And they're actually in a state of negotiation with the government. So it would be there would be a link to make there. I hope it will be done, but that I think we have here. We would have an opportunity to make a link between the climate fight back and the workers fight back. Merci, thank you.
Great. Okay, so I'll share some thoughts and remarks and questions, and then we'll turn it over to John and Sarah to respond to some of this. And then we'll see if there's a little bit of time for an extra question or two. This particular part of our meeting is being recorded. And I would like to propose that we consider placing this recording on our website. I'm not sure if the pamphlet, a link to the pamphlet is on our website. If not, it should be. Um, I would like to use this video not just to share with Gen members, but others as well. Uh, and I want to share the booklet also, the pamphlet also, which is a wonderful resource. Um, I want to introduce it to groups that I'm part of, whether it's my local DSA chapter or a couple of other socialist groups that I'm in touch with, or Pittsburgh Green New Deal, which is a group that I'm involved in, and so on. Um, I'd also like to raise a question about whether one of our public forums should be on this, with John and Sarah participating, and get if we've got a dozen or a little over a dozen people now. but it would be great if we have a forum that would have 100 or so people. We did have a successful public forum co-sponsored with Mark's Mail a short time ago, and maybe we would want to consider proposing some kind of joint effort, not just with Mark's Mail, but some other groups also co-sponsoring a public online forum. And I would like to get finally emails from email addresses from John and Sarah so that I can be in touch with them more and correspond with them more. Those are my comments. John and Sarah, over to you.
Do you want to go first, Sarah? Or?
John, or oh, I don't mind. I'm happy to. Okay. So yeah. Green, the first thing that mentioned green capitalism, and I mean, I think, and the need for, yeah, holding back things and from getting so much worse that we've got, nothing left to save, really. I think, yes, we should hope that capitalists go more green, but I think always at the same time, it's so important to point out this isn't the answer. And there's always the risk that if we talk about green capitalism and work too closely with green capitalists, people think you don't have to do more. So it's a difficult balance, I think. Translation would be great, clearly. Mutual aid, and I think what we've tried to do is, I mean, I don't think either is enough on their own, and we don't want to go down the sort of it's all going to be done small scale and the big scale, and forget about the big scale, which is causing disaster. I think that it's the point that we've tried to make is that these two things can be done hand in hand, and that each can boost the other, and that the mutual aid isn't just about the immediate achievements, which is really important, but also about a model of a different way of doing things. And I guess that leads neatly onto Rojava, which also tries to provide a model of a different way of doing things, but at the moment is under absolutely massive attack. And I don't think I've got time to go into it now. I mean, I've got a lot of articles on my website because I write a weekly news review. So if anybody's wants to follow it up, it's sarahglynn.net, and I haven't put up the most recent ones, but all the other ones are there. I'll get it there. Yeah, I mean, if anybody's heard about, the so-called interim government in Syria has just set up a committee that's supposed to be pulling together their conference to decide the nature of the future of the Syrian state, and there's not one person on it who's Kurdish or from the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, which basically international powers are kind of allowing to be written out of the equation. And yeah, the ecological side of it, it's really difficult in a war, and it's probably the bit that's the least well developed, to be frank, but it is there and it is important. And if anybody's interested, there's a little pamphlet called Making Rojava Green Again, which describes things really nicely. Yeah. And I think, yeah, the example with Amazon, I think it's really nice that, yeah, I mean, everything we can look at, basically, there is this climate dimension, and just pulling the threads together, I think is really important. I'll hand over to John now. I'm sure there's lots of things I've not covered.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that the point about confronting fossil fuel capitalism is absolutely critical. The fact is that they have to be forced to strand their assets. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. We cannot have the production of this destructive production continuing, because as was observed, everything else is hanging in the balance. Um, there's every indication that the process of climate change is not the relatively incremental linear process that it was once thought to be, but that in fact there is a web of causality in which the effects of climate change become causes of climate change, and the thing is cascading. And we already don't know the dimensions of what we face, even if capitalism ended tomorrow. We don't know the exactly what we face. So it's critical that everything possible be done to to address this question. And at the same time, I think that the strategy of green capitalism is, for the most part, a scam. I think we're dealing with a situation where they're talking about, carbon capture, where they're talking about a massive mining and retooling operation to create private electric vehicles, when the real question is public systems of public transportation. On every front, the solutions they're looking for, to the extent that they're actually going to pursue them, are ruinous non-solutions. So working class intervention in what is done is absolutely essential. I would also say that I think it was very important that Susan stressed the question of mutual aid, which I think is a really important point, and Sarah deals with it so well within the booklet. I think it's true. Susan sort of alluded to this, that there has been a somewhat contemptuous attitude to the question of mutual aid on the socialist left, which I think is very, very nearsighted. First of all, people are forced to take this kind of route and this kind of approach by the sheer level of social abandonment that is occurring in the present situation. But secondly, I think that the initiatives of communities are something that we need to nurture. There's been a suggestion made here in Canada that the model we're looking for with regards to climate change is the Second World War, where the state stepped in, put everything on a war footing, declared an emergency. And I find that a troubling proposition. I don't think we want to just give a free hand to the state to deal with it the way they want, because they're not going to act in good faith. So the initiatives have to come from working people. And I agree that there must be an overall plan, not just a myriad of individual initiatives. But those individual initiatives coming from communities are the building blocks, and they're absolutely precious and absolutely necessary. And finally, on the question of Amazon, I think Amazon is the epitome of the exploitation of human labor with scientific precision. It's absolutely a vile corporation that exploits outrageously and is responsible for egregious levels of environmental degradation as well. And it is, as was suggested, a case in point that we have to challenge these capitalist interests from the standpoint of fighting them on workers' issues around wages and working conditions and such like, but we have to fight them on their absolutely reckless and deplorable conduct with regards to the environment and climate. So that point, I think, was very well taken. Thanks.
Well, now let's see. It's almost 9 o'clock. We've almost gone an hour. And I'm concerned if I take another round of discussion, we'll exceed that by a significant amount. It seems to me, therefore, this may be a good place to pause, to stop for now, with the understanding that there's going to be quite a lot of follow-up. Now, there's a little note from Susan, which says, what does it say? Does anyone have any objection to posting this video on Jen's website? So, folks should indicate if they have a problem with that, and if not, then Susan is going to make sure that it gets posted on the website so this can be shared. I would like to thank John and Sarah very much for producing the pamphlet, for the work that they're already doing, for being here to share some of this. And I will look forward to working with you, and I'm sure a number of us feel that way, and that we'll want to be discussing further discussing some of the stuff that we've started to discuss now, and including discussing it with you and others, and so on. This was marvelous. Anything further on this? Okay, then let us move on. Um, we have an embarrassment of riches. Mark alluded to a demonstration. There is a written report that he has sent out, and I think everyone has gotten that. But so we'll have country reports.